I've met a bunch of you before, but not everyone. So I'm Jeremy Craybill. I'm around here a fair bit these days. So today's called How to Think About Your Startup, but I think it's kind of a misnomer. I would call it more like how I think about startups, and you can listen or not if you want to. My background, so I've been in startups to some extent, pretty much my entire life almost. I mean, I was managing director of a young achievement company in year 11, started my first company about 20 years ago. Came back, I went to high school in Australia, but I'd gone to the US for uni, came back, and I was sort of lucky. When I was in uni, it was the dawn of the internet, and I was really into it. So that translated easily for me into consulting work, which I did in Perth for a while, and then had a good friend who got involved with the startup scene in the US, and called me in 1998 to come out and interview for a growing startup in Austin, Texas. I moved over there, and I've been doing startups ever since, really sort of on the traditional American VC-backed startup. So my first startup went IPO just after I joined it, sort of in the crazy late 90s. Went from there to another software startup that got acquired by a large company. And so I just loved what was happening at that time. It was a pretty different time to now. I think in some ways now is more exciting though. And then went from there to a few other companies, worked at eBay for a while, managing one of their subsidiaries, worked at another startup that recently got acquired by Zazzle. And I got to the point in my startup career, I'd sort of gone climbing the startup ladder, I guess if you will, from starting my own companies to going and working for founders for the most part, and then sort of getting to the point where I'm on boards and going to VC, raising capital with these guys. And for me, the next step logically was sort of become CEO of a large venture-backed startup. And I just realized I didn't want to do that. I didn't really want to do that at all, in fact. And for me, I've always been motivated by solving problems and making things and making products. And so for me, that's what my journey was about. That's why I was into it. And as I went up the management chain, I just found that I was getting more and more divorced from that, the larger and larger these companies and teams were getting. And I wanted to go back to basics. So sort of stepped away from startups for a while, ran my own consulting practice where I was just helping customers build products. And then recently, about 3 years ago, started my own company here in Melbourne. Been back in Australia for about 5 years. We do marketing automation solutions for Salesforce.com customers. Super small company. I still get to write a lot of code, and I like that. So for me, I guess what I'm trying to say, that's so you can understand where I'm coming from, but I think the purpose of today's talk is really to get everyone in this room to sort of think about why you're here. I mean, why are you interested in startups, and what could a startup do for you? What could you do for a startup, and is it the right thing for you? Because I don't think it's the right thing for everybody, and I think that it's really important, especially when you're starting out in any endeavor, to really understand why you're doing it and what you want out of it. So that's sort of where my focus today is going to be. I guess I'd like to know a little bit about you guys. So just some quick polls of hands, just so I know who I'm talking to. Who here is currently running or in a startup of some sort? Okay. Who here is thinking about one? All right. Who here is just came in the wrong door, or is just here just because they might be interested? They just want to know more. Anyone like that? All right. Cool. I think the focus for this, I think this talk is going to be most relevant for people who are not doing a startup right now, but or are just got started or thinking about it. So, if this isn't useful, feel free to leave or bust up in the wine. I'd also like to say a little bit about advice. So I guess this is sort of an advice talk, and I think in startups and around any sort of startup ecosystem and map and any place like that I've ever been, there's a lot of advice, and I don't like advice, and I think that it's really easy to just feel like you have to listen to what someone who's more experienced or has been around longer than you has said, and I think that's just a horrible idea, and you shouldn't do it. You should get as much input as you can, filter it yourself, and make your own decisions. That's what startups are all about. So I would encourage you to ignore anything I say that you think is not relevant to you. So let's talk about startups and sort of why people do startups, what they get out of it. But let's start by defining what a startup is. So there's a lot of definitions for startup. I think for the purposes of this talk, I would define startup as a new company or venture that you or a group of people are starting with the intent to scale it. So that's a pretty broad definition. It would probably rule out like someone who wants to open a single coffee shop, but maybe not someone who has this idea that maybe if they did this coffee shop right and financed it correctly, they could expand it and scale it to 5 coffee shops. You want to start, might be high risk, might not, but you want it to scale. You want this idea that can grow. You want a high growth enterprise to some extent, to whatever your end goals are for it. I think there's a lot of reasons that people do startups. I think for me, it's just what I do. I mean, from a very young age, like I said, I was into problem solving and creating things. And so for me, it's kind of hard to imagine how I wouldn't have gotten into startups. Because for me, what I've gotten out of the experience is the ability to create products that solve problems and to do it in a really hands-on way. And I've had the most fun in the smallest organizations I've been a part of. So that's why I do it. There's a lot of other things I personally get out of it that people may or may not get out of it. So, you know, I work weird flexible hours. I like to start late and end late sometimes, or start early, end early. I like the flexibility. I like having control over my own destiny. But I think it's important to realize that compared to jobs, startups are really annoying and hard in a lot of ways. Like having a job is really easy. It's so easy. And everyone in this room can get a job. Doing a startup for the reasons of money alone, I think, is a mistake that a lot of people fall into. And I'm not saying that it's not the right motivator for some people. I don't think it's a great motivator for startups in general. And I think that people who are doing it just for money, you run a much higher risk of burnout. So even if you're highly motivated by money, and I've worked with some really effective people who really only care about money, so I can't totally take it away as a motivator, but I think that if you're going into an endeavor like a startup, which is going to be over multiple years, may or may not succeed in terms of like, will this take off and is this something I can do for a long time or sell it or whatever? If you're going to take on some endeavor like that, you should make your success criteria such that even if that's a financial failure at the end of that period, you're not burnt out on your job and life. And I think a lot of people get into startups just for money. That's a really easy thing to happen. It's got a super high failure rate. A lot of people are in this for many years without making huge money. And so if what you can get out of it is the journey, I just think you're going to have a better time, and it's something that you can really make a career out of. Like, you know, you hear a lot of stories about people going and hitting it big on one, you know, the secretary of Facebook, stuff like that. Those are really rare stories, and the reality is that this is just a kind of weird class of job at the end of the day, where it's just higher risk and a lot of more questions. But I would just think about why you want to do it, and just make sure that you're getting into it for a reason that makes sense to you. It doesn't need to be the same reasons as me. It just is something that you want to do. And sort of going back to the millionaire conversation, I think especially now, and when you look at online literature about startups and you know, all of that stuff, there's this massive echo chamber that's really influenced by sort of the California style startups, where if you're just reading, I'm going to read all the startup stuff online, it's heavily skewed towards the traditional California VC-backed model of startups. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that is a pretty small subset of all of the different ways that you can start and run a business. And so I think it's really easy to get caught up in just, if you're only reading stuff online, I think you'd be doing yourself a good service to like spend some more time around MAP and spend some more time around small businesses who are local, who are doing stuff here in a very real way, rather than watching Silicon Valley on TV and saying, hey, I want to be like Hooli or whatever. So, you know, and with that, I think it really helps to I guess what I'm really saying is just do it because you want to do it at the end of the day, but know the reasons that you're doing it. And startups in so many ways are just so much more annoying and stressful than having a job. But some people, it's just a better overall package. And that's what it is for me, that I vastly prefer small growing companies trying to solve interesting problems to large companies where I'm a tiny cog doing some stuff that someone else is going to do when I'm not around. So then in terms of like what sort of company you would be in, if you can find the intersection of what you're good at and what you enjoy and what has the rewards that are appropriate for you, and that may not be financial, that's a really good place to start. And sometimes you can work your way into that. I mean, I've worked with a bunch of people who were kind of long shot outsiders to ever, if you had met these people 10 years ago, you'd be like, there's no way that person's ever doing a startup. They just looked into it and they're like, yeah, I want to get into this as a career. One of the greatest programmers I ever worked with was a truck driver until he was in his mid-30s. Just decided he wanted to do something else and taught himself programming, got a job, and one of the greatest developers I've ever worked with. So you can work your way into, I think this applies for startups or careers, but there's different ways in. And MAP is a great group to be around, even if you don't go through the MAP program. There's lots of good stuff that happens here that can sort of be an intro into what's happening in different ways. And then also know your alternative. I mean, I think a lot of people probably have jobs that is their alternative, or maybe you're thinking about doing a startup because you hate your job. So maybe think of other jobs that you could have, or what else you would be doing if it wasn't this particular startup or this particular idea. And there's this whole like celebrate failure thing in startups. I totally advocate that. I think you learn a lot from any sort of experience, whether it's a failure or a success. But when you're doing your own startup, there are also some really bad failures. So there's some risks there as well. I mean, financially specifically, but when people just say all failures are good, like not all failures are good. I've seen some really bad failures. So when you're thinking about, I want to start a company, or I met these guys and they want me to come along and help them with this thing, I'm probably starting to repeat myself around this, but I think just being able to answer what you expect from the experience and what you want to get out of it, and thinking about it that way will help you not be confused and disappointed along the way. And going back to the kind of financial thing, I think also just expecting that this is going to be interesting, a really interesting experience, and you learn things from it. That's how I sort of got into startups in a big way. You know, I've been back in consulting after sort of doing a couple things in uni around entrepreneurship. I didn't think I wanted to work for a startup. I didn't think I wanted to move back to the US. And I interviewed with just the smartest group of people I'd ever seen. And I was just like, I just want to be around these people because I can learn something. That was my expectation. That's really all I wanted out of it. And so once you set those goals and what you're expecting out of the experience, and also having an understanding of what the people coming along with you are expecting, because I think even with people you know really well, you can kind of take for granted that you can believe that they are doing it for the same reasons as you, and that's very rarely the case. So I think that helps as well when you're doing any sort of activity with other people. But I think especially in a small startup, 2-3 people type of team, you should really understand what you're expecting and what your cohorts are. And then kind of thinking how you're going to get there. I mean, if you're, what are you trying to do with your company, with your idea? That's kind of a too large a topic for tonight. So let's talk about ideas. I think, how many people here have applied to MAP before? Liars? All right. Who doesn't like putting up their hands for things? All right, so a bunch of people have applied to MAP before. I think if you're sort of coming at this with a blank slate and you're looking for ideas and you're trying to think about hey, we'd like to start a company. Maybe you know one or two people who have sort of similar goals with what you're trying to get out of it, but you don't have a really specific problem you're trying to solve. It's kind of an exciting time. It's fun. I like ideation and just sort of throwing things against the wall. I would say a few things about it. I'm very high-tech oriented, so this doesn't apply to all industries, but I think especially in high-tech, there's an unbelievably huge and growing opportunity in high-tech that if you're doing the right thing, I think it gives you a really high chance of success when you realize that over the past, really since the inception of computing, there's been an exploding gap between what technology can deliver right now and how it's being delivered and adopted around the world, and how long that takes, and how long that cycle is. And what's been happening, right, is that, like, you take any sort of, I guess a good example is like large company IT adoption. So the cycle times for how large companies go through any sort of set of technology, take any example that everyone would be familiar with, like, I don't know, ATMs, maybe that's not a great example, but the overall cycle time for technologies in large enterprises has really not been heavily compressed compared to what's able to happen in technology and in innovation in that time period. So I think accelerating change is something that is here to stay and will be accelerating for the foreseeable future. The opportunity for startups is your ability to deliver a superior technology product, a superior technology service or experience today compared to, even if you're trying to do something that everyone is doing, your ability to do that, to actually produce a product or experience that's vastly superior to what's out there and what's been permeated in the market, is here. It's here in everything you do. The challenge with a startup is not producing something that's more superior. It's doing it in such a way that you can get it out to the market and be that next level, that next wave of technology. So I think if you look at, I'm just trying to think of some good examples, but the convergence of what we can do today with hardware and software and what we could do 5 years ago is so different, and it's accelerating that if you want to look for good ideas in high tech, you don't have to look very far. What you want to find is an idea where you have the ability to execute as a team, and where there's a real opportunity, and you can actually sell what you're trying to do or make it work as a business. So when you're thinking about, if you're in the stage of ideation and you're thinking about what to do as a business, I can't tell you what you should be doing, but I always start with maximizing your inputs and making sure if you're starting to gear up to looking at what you would be doing for a business, look beyond your backyard. So there's a bunch of ways to do that. I've got some reading at the end of these slides I think can give you some good inputs and ideas for sort of how to look at the bigger picture. One of the challenges that we see with MAP applicants, for instance, I think it's understandable because a lot of the MAP applicants are uni or very recent uni students, but we see a lot of like hyper local and university related ideas that, not to say they're all bad, but they're fairly limited in scope for what you could actually be doing. And there's some pretty big problems out there that people could be looking to solve. And I think part of the problem is just not having the input. Like, you've been in your room looking out your window is uni, and it's Melbourne and it's Swanston Street. So the ideas that you get are very related to that. And I would just say that when you're starting to look at ideas, maximize your inputs. One of the things that I recommend doing is, if you know people who are experienced in business and are in an industry that you're totally unfamiliar with, just ask them what's the biggest problem that they face as a company in their job. Like, what are the challenges? What's something that they just wish would get fixed? And you learn some interesting stuff about really any profession will tell you stuff you don't know, and just gives you more ideas about what you could be doing. And what you're trying to look for is problems that people want solutions for and are willing to pay for. When you're thinking about ideas, I think another issue we see with MAP applicants specifically, and I'm talking about MAP because I see all the applicants every year, so it's sort of top of mind for me, is ideas that are that have something good in them. In fact, I think of the 60 so applicants we had this year, there wasn't a single one where it's just a terrible idea, it's never gonna work. But some of them are off the marks in ways that could easily be remedied. So I think when you're thinking about what you're doing, or if you've had an idea, or you saw something work, or you did a project with someone and it seemed like it was gonna work, you're gonna build a business around it, I would first step back and look at ways to extend or change that idea in a way that could change it for the better. So techniques that I like using, they seem kind of obvious, but if you actually explicitly think about these things when you've got an idea, like, could I combine this with another business or idea? Have we brainstormed two things that we could actually put together? Or is there too much in here? Can we simplify it? Or is it too hyper-local? Can we expand it? So, like an example, I heard a pitch of someone who wanted to do like local grocery delivery to students only who only spoke one specific language. So that's like, there's obviously something there, and this is a problem that this person was trying to solve because they're a student who speaks that specific language. But that's like an idea where, hey, maybe there is something there. Maybe it's not just grocery delivery. What's the challenge? Why did you need that service? Is it because of the language barrier? Is it because you're a student? Is it because there isn't good access to grocery stores? Or maybe it's something else. So I think that's the type of idea that can be broadened out and say, hey, actually, there is just a problem with accessibility of goods in Australia for non-English speakers. And maybe you could do something around that as an example. And then big ideas like, I'm disappointed every year that we don't have more people like pitching time travel or seriously, well, maybe not quite time travel, but like we did have an immortality pitch. I loved that. But like big ideas, brain-computer interface is going to be absolutely massive. I would love to see some pitches around that sort of stuff. Big ideas, transportation. If you think about how backwards transportation. Obviously, these are hard problems to solve, but don't be afraid of looking at those big ideas and sort of, maybe there is a way to figure out why trains today go the same speed that they went 100 years ago. Like, that is absolutely insane to me. I wish someone would solve it. Maybe there's something that can be done there. But I would also say, when you're thinking of ideas, don't be afraid of totally unoriginal ideas either, and ignore people who tell you that unoriginal ideas are bad in startups. There's so much to be said for just simply being better at executing an idea in the market that you're in than anybody else, and that's what makes you successful. I think in startups and in business in general is just executing better. So reading about a startup that just got a whole bunch of funding in China or the U.S. and saying, hey, maybe we could do that in Australia, and maybe we could be the first, and maybe that would be good. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I sort of like those types of ideas because the challenges of execution, then there's already a roadmap for what this business will look like. It's just executing it and being the first and being the best. So you've got an idea now. You want to start a business. You want to sort of figure out, hey, can we do this or not? So you probably want to evaluate your idea. I would recommend it to the greatest extent possible. I think a lot of the traditional startup echo chamber these days talks a lot about this. So if you've read that stuff, I think you'll probably be familiar with stuff like minimum viable product and customer validation. But you really need to do it. And I also would say that if you're at this point where you're thinking of starting a business, or maybe you're even just about to start one, that you don't need to treat it as an all or nothing proposition. You don't even need to leave your day job. You can do a lot of validation and testing and get to the point where, hey, this actually looks like it's going to work and people are actually giving us money while you're doing other stuff. And there's a lot to be said for that because it allows you to really iterate quickly and fail and not feel like you're under pressure to pay the rent. So I'm specifically a huge proponent of keeping your day job or doing something like part-time consulting to extend your startup runway as long as possible until you feel like you're really onto something. My current business is entirely self-funded, but we did consulting we've been at it 3 years, so we did consulting almost the entire time through there just to keep that base cash flow until the business really got going. And I think there's there's a huge benefit in doing that, and it doesn't chain you to the idea of raising money or taking loans from friends and family. I think it helps a lot to develop a pitch, and something like a 2 or 3 minute pitch, even if you have no plans to like deliver it to investors or MAP. That process of developing your value proposition and being able to articulate it in a couple minutes, I think, is a very valuable thing. And I think that even for people who don't do it, sort of don't sit down and get a bunch of PowerPoint slides, you're going to have some sort of pitch. It might just be really bad because you've never really thought about it. So you're going to need to explain what you're doing to your friends. You need to explain what you're doing to people you want to come onto your team. So developing that pitch gives you a framework for talking about what you're trying to do, and also allows you to think about it in such a way that would motivate other people, which I think is a very helpful thing to do. Just start doing it. Just start doing it. Just try it. There's most ideas, unless you're trying to do something like hardware, so many ideas you can at least start to test, maybe even start to make some money with a totally fake service that not fake, but I would say a mock-up service. So an example, we had a MAP team, a pitch that, great pitch, actually had a bunch of customers, was doing like matching of some sort of, it was like students and tutors, and actually had a lot of users, and it was literally like one web page, and he just matched people up over email, but sort of made it look like it was this smart matchmaking service. So that's the sort of thing you can start doing, but there's always some way to start doing it. Just get stuff together, and you don't need to quit your day job to start doing it, and just to figure out, is this something for me? Is there something here that's promising? I think once you're down the path a little bit, that as soon as possible, you should start to measure everything you want to improve and look at it regularly and keep metrics. I'm going to be doing some sort of dashboard presentation for some dashboard tools for the MAP teams that can actually chart like every business metric. I used to run some big metric dashboards at eBay where, I mean, we're looking at like 1,000 different metrics across the entire business. Anything that you want to improve needs to be measured. And so I would just recommend, hey, just start building a spreadsheet. I think that's pretty much where most of the MAP teams start, is weekly spreadsheets of just taking data dumps, looking at what they're doing, and then trying to improve it and figuring out why it's not working. And if you're starting out, especially if this is your first time starting out, you've got any estimates for anything, just at least double them. That's not an exaggeration. It sounds sort of prescriptive, but your estimates will be off by at least double. So don't think you're going to do everything as quickly. And I think part of the reason for that is when your estimates might actually be accurate, but you just can't, you're not going to spend 100% of your time on that because there's so many other things that you're going to need to be doing as you're scaling that business. And I've talked about stretching out your runway. There's a lot of benefits to stretching out your runway financially, like just from a personal perspective. So if you're going into a startup, you're going to need to either be making money or getting investment to be able to be taking money out of the business, of course. If you can find a way to make it work, to be able to run a business and still have a source of income of some sort that keeps the lights on, it takes away a lot of pressure from what you're trying to do as a startup. It takes away the pressure to raise money, which will give up control. It takes away the pressure to force some sort of revenue model that might not be perfect or might not be ready, or stops you from investing in things that will get you an appropriate return over a period of time. So to the greatest extent possible, like, try to extend that runway. One of the things that I think a lot of people in tech, even like fairly junior software developers, don't realize is that the local contracting market, and I'm speaking specifically about Melbourne, is pretty good in terms of hourly rates compared to a full-time job. So, you know, I speak to people who are in full-time jobs, junior developer of some sort, making, you know, 60, 70, something like that. Could be getting consulting gigs, $80 an hour. That sort of, there's a lot of that sort of economics in IT. So being able to get that type of work can give you a lot of flexibility. Like, you can go half-time and still be making the same amount of money. So if you've got the ability to do that, I think it's worth looking into. So putting together your initial team, I think there's not really any silver bullet for this. I think the most common setup that I see that works well are people who have worked together and have worked together on a similar type of project, but in complementary positions, like a business development and a product development person. And so they know they work well together, they know they got a shared vision, they know what the other person can achieve, and now they've talked about it and they say, hey, let's forget working for Accenture, whoever, we want to start our own company. That's good because it's convenient and you've been able to prove a lot about that and you've developed a working relationship. But there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, ideally you want fully complementary skill sets. And when I say complementary, the skills that I think about in startups, sort of the skill areas, are pretty broad and there's only a handful of them. So it's really the product people, the people who are building and designing the product or service that you're rolling out. You've got the sales and marketing people who are convincing people to purchase this and getting them to purchase it. The operations people who are keeping that well-oiled machine going, and stuff like accounting and HR fits into that as you grow, but also things like ongoing customer service, just operations generally. And then leadership. So I sort of see those as the most important broad skill sets that you have in a small company. And when you bring people together, I think that's what I'm talking about with complementary. So I think in a lot of high-tech startups, it's like the product person and the salesperson. But I just think that you just need to find a group that works where you know you can work together. And then I think a lot of people ask, like, well, is it okay to work with friends or coworkers or family? And I think the answer is that's totally irrelevant. Like, what matters the most is that you have a shared expectation of commitment. You know what the other people expect from what you're going to be doing together, and you know you can achieve it together, and you work well or believe that you can work well together. But around clear expectations, I think there's a number of issues and non-issues that startups can encounter especially around equity and control and involvement, that I think you can avoid some problems early if you address them. So I think one of the questions that you should be able to answer as a group is, all right, we've agreed to split the equity 3 ways. What happens if after 6 months someone just needs to go back to work because we're not making as much money as we thought we would? That's a question I think you should be able to answer as a group. And there isn't really a right answer, but you should think about it and think about like what that would mean and how you would control that. On the subject of equity, I think a lot of, maybe not as many these days, but I get a lot of questions about how should we split the ownership of the company? Like, this person isn't as good at programming. Should we give them 20% instead of 25%? And my advice there universally, and I don't think it always ends up being the case, but for the vast majority of people, it just doesn't matter. As a group, you're either going to make tons of money together and the ownership's going to be worth a lot of money, or it's going to be worth nothing. So starting off like bartering over points on ownership, I just think is not that important. And when you're looking at bringing additional people into the team, I think another thing that a lot of people think about is giving up equity. We're giving up 5% of the company. Well, the thing that you need to realize is that if that person adds at least 5% value to your organization, you're all out ahead. So I think I'm kind of outspoken on the topic, but I just think that for equity, you just need a setup that has everyone on a near equal footing. And if it's not an equal footing, then there should be a really good reason. Maybe it's that someone can only work a couple days a week for the first couple of years. But I really think that, I've never spoken to anyone who's like, man, I wish at the beginning of our company we just hadn't agreed that this person would get 5% more than me. Like, it's just never an issue. On the subject of control, I do think that it's really beneficial for the entire team to agree who the boss is and who has control over the company. And I personally believe that it should always be one person. I think that it gives you a clearer sense of who the ultimate decision maker is. I think it's very difficult to run a business, especially once you get past the very early stages, extremely difficult to run a business as a committee. And I think that somebody ultimately needs to play the CEO role who has responsibility for the company and who's the leader of the company. And even if at the beginning you're not sure who that is, I think that you really need to answer that question as soon as possible. And maybe one of the ways you could think about it is if we had an offer to buy us tomorrow, and let's say there's two people, like, do we need to unanimously agree, or could this person, is it really up to this person? Or where's the negotiation for that sort of stuff? I think that it really helps an organization to have that one leader who's ultimately responsible for the most difficult decisions in the company. There's like Traction 101 listed, and I think I might have said that as a bullet point, but then I was writing this and I was like Traction, there's a lot of stuff that you can read about what Traction means and what we're looking for at MAP. And if you've been to my MAP talk about how to pitch to MAP, there's a whole thing about Traction. And that whole thing about Traction is about getting into MAP. It's not about what matters for a business, honestly. Like, it's about what is important to convey in a pitch about Traction. But for a young business of any sort, the most important thing about when you're starting out, when you've got like your sale number 1 and how long it takes you to get to customer number 2 and customer number 3, and where you're doing in terms of sales and what you're expecting to do, I think the most important thing is to understand your customers and understand how to accelerate that. So talk to your customers. This sounds super obvious, and it's like ridiculous to even have this as a slide, really, but if you're not talking to every customer you have as a small company and understanding what their motivations are and what you could do better and what you could do worse and why they went with you as opposed to someone else, like, you are really in trouble. And the best way to adapt as a business is to understand what every one of your customers wants and knows, and then also to build up that initial set of customers as your like sort of advocates. I mean, I think the first few customers you have should be sort of customers for life, and you should love each other and see each other. Every time you see each other, just feel like you were part of what we did here, and bring them along as part of that journey. But then as you scale, really understand what's happening with your customer base and what you can do to adjust that. And that adjustment, if it's customer-based only, will be the best type of adjustment that you can make for the most part. So scaling. So let's talk about scaling a little bit. I think going back to what I started out originally, like, your personal goals for what you want out of starting your own business or being part of a small company really dictate what that scaling is going to look like in terms of your goals and how you go about doing that. So, one of my goals is to specifically not run a massive company. I don't like managing gigantic teams. My goal is to have a reasonably sized, not super huge software business that is very successful and have customers that love what we're doing. So for other people, that might be, we want to raise $20 million and we want to build this business up to be a multi-billion dollar business. So understanding what your goals are and what the needs of your business are, I think helps adjust that scaling conversation and helps you plan out what you're trying to do. So with that, I think I've talked about bootstrapping a fair amount. I'm obviously a big fan of bootstrapping. Bootstrapping has some serious disadvantages in terms of if you've got any sort of, and most people do have a business where you can directly convert additional money into additional customers at some type of net profit. Most startups are in that situation where you can literally pump money into that business, and for every dollar you pump in, you're going to get $2 back in a year, whatever. So as a result of that, if you are bootstrapping and if you do not have access to capital, you will be growing a business much more slowly than if you go and raise capital. So I think that's a good reason to think about why you would want capital, is that it just gives you the ability to acquire customers and build your business more quickly. When you think about what MAP does, I love the MAP program. I am a volunteer and spend quite a few hours here because I just love what MAP is doing. I don't have a particular connection to the university. I just happened to meet a few of the guys, Rowan, especially when I first moved here, and just loved what the program was doing and wanted to get involved. So it's an awesome program, and there's lots of ways to get involved, not just as an applicant. So there's many events. I think it's good to keep on the radar, get on the mailing list if you're not on it already. And so what MAP gives you if you get into the program, is $20,000, office space for a year, mentorship and access to like university and MAP resources. And that's really valuable. $20,000 is absolutely nothing when it comes to capital. So don't do it for the money. But when you look at the success that a lot of the teams through MAP have had in terms of raising money after MAP, I think that can be a really good path to get on. If you don't know much about raising capital and you want to look into it, the MAP, the MAP mentors and MAP teams have lots of skills and knowledge in that area, and you don't need to be in MAP to get that advice. Like, you can talk to people in this building. Everyone in this building will talk to you, I think. Everyone? Most people? And then small capital versus big capital. So there's other ways to raise money. I mean, raising money and trading equity among friends and family, especially if you have rich friends and family, can be a good way to go. Rich friends and family who trust you. Not really a joke, actually. It is a really good way to raise capital. If you know rich people who trust you and will give you money in exchange for equity, you should do that rather than raising venture capital all day. I think it's a good way to start. And if you're in the type of business where you need like on the order of less than $1 million, $50,000, $100,000, there's quite a few ways to get access to that level of capital. Not just from friends and family, but there's a pretty big local angel investor network as well. And then once you start looking at bigger capital and institutional investment, venture capital, I think at that point, you're probably beyond the scope of tonight's presentation in terms of pros and cons and how you go about doing it. And that's probably a presentation as of itself. But again, I just think that when you're looking at these things, make sure you know why you're doing them and what this desired outcome is. And then creative hiring is something I think a lot of people don't really realize. When you're in a startup and you're starting up a business, there's a lot, like, people work for very different reasons, and people take jobs for very different reasons. And a lot of people love startups and love the idea of startups and are willing to get involved in startups in an arrangement that does not necessarily equate to trading cash for time. So I think that most people in small startups who are, trying to do something exciting and can pitch it as something exciting have access to a much larger talent pool than you think for close to zero money. So a lot of salespeople will work, if they've got the ability to work flexibly and part-time, they'll be willing to work on commission only. You got interns who just want experience, who are willing to work for part-time weekend basis for little money or a reduced thing. But then you also there's a lot of professional people who might be making great money and hate their jobs and just want something else to be involved with and are willing to work for really a way below market salary and maybe some amount of equity. There's a lot of things you can get out of these guys in terms of a mutual relationship where people are not working for startups for the money, and you can getting access to that can help you scale as a business. All right. Well, I think we're sort of getting into Q&A time, aren't we, Rowan? Yeah, perfect. So that's pretty much what I wanted to go over. I want to talk about some recommended reading. So I think there are some things that that people should look at. And I give a pitching seminar with Rowan every year for the MAP teams that are going through the pitching process. And my number one piece of advice for them, which I think is actually pretty relevant for just people who are thinking about startups as a whole, is to watch 100 pitches. And 100 is not an exaggeration. And 100 3-minute pitches is 5 hours of watching. That's probably less TV than you watch in a week anyway. It isn't that much time. And what you'll get and YouTube is a good source of that. There's a bunch of websites like Best Pitches that have a whole bunch of pitch-related resources. But watching 100 pitches gives you a level of input of what good pitches look like, what bad pitches look like. You can critique the businesses. One of my favorite things about MAP actually is watching the pitches every year. And I just love it because you get a sense of like every business, even if you think like, yeah, there's no way these guys are getting in ever. But why is that? Like just thinking about what the difference is when you're looking at pitches. Think about the difference between the good pitches and the bad pitches, the good business ideas and the bad business ideas. How could you adapt the bad ones to be good? I think it just gets you in that mindset. It's something I really recommend doing, and just part of the broadening of your input, sort of getting inputs that you don't have access to now. I think if you're thinking about the early days, it's a little bit echo chambery, but Founders at Work by Jessica Livingston from Y Combinator is a book that's just sort of like interviews with founders of, for the most part, successful companies several years down, but talking about the very early days. It's just sort of an interesting book. It's factual. I found it kind of motivational. Stanford Technology Ventures program out of Stanford University has probably the best set of online material in terms of talks, speeches. They have just a ton of podcast type material from a huge variety of people. Like they've had NFL quarterbacks and Mark Zuckerberg and people who went bankrupt, and just a huge variety of content. I think those are good starting points. There's a writer called Noah Wasserman who is a little bit off the beaten path for this type of startup stuff, but he talks about the motivations of founders and why people start businesses and why they don't, and some of the challenges that early founders face. And I think that can be useful if you're thinking about why to go into business. Steve Blank and Eric Ries, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with like Lean Startup. Steve Blank wrote a book about customer development called 4 Steps to the Epiphany that I think is really important especially if you're in web and software businesses. And then local reading, there's a paper put out by Deloitte called Positioning for Prosperity, Catching the Next Wave, which talks about the sort of macro growth industries in Australia over the next 20 years. And I think it's a really good read if you want a big picture view of what's happening in this country, to give you some ideas of where are those exploding segments of the Australian economy, because they're not all that obvious, but they're pretty real, and they're kind of big business, big industry stuff, but that can be a good source, and there's some interesting stuff that's happening. The guys on the right are kind of the creators of the startup echo chamber, but they produce some good stuff. Like I really like Paul Graham's essays, and you can go through the other guys and see what you think.